The Path is a teaching series sponsored by World Missionary Evangelism. We hope that this series will deepen your knowledge and walk in our Lord Jesus Christ. Here's your host, John Cathcart.
Well, we continue talking about the martyrdom of Stephen. We know that in the day of Jesus Christ and the early church, at that time in history, I think even as today, the Jews prided themselves in their national leader Moses, in the written law and the oral law, and in the temple. And the temple, of course, was a magnificent structure. They certainly could be proud of that as an architectural achievement. But Stephen has been accused of speaking against Moses and the law and the temple. And this to the Jews was blasphemy. So in his speech, his oration, his message, Stephen points out that Moses had told the children of Israel of a coming prophet that God would raise up from among them who would be like unto Moses. And then Stephen identifies this coming prophet as being the same entity that was in the, quote, church, unquote, in the wilderness with the same angel which spoke to Moses in Sinai. Now, in our King James Bibles, as we read this speech of Stephen, Stephen says that he was with the church. Well, of course, the English word church is not in the original documents. In the original, the Greek word is ecclesia, which means a calling out. Now, there is what is called the ecclesia or remnant doctrine, and a common theme in the history of Israel was the idea of a remnant being left. In Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah is at a crisis point in his life, and he gets a vision of God, and basically the Lord tells him about the future and promises a remnant. So this remnant from a remnant from a remnant is a familiar Old Testament document. And you can think of ecclesia as being equivalent to the word remnant. It's the called out. And so it reminds us of the remnant doctrine of Isaiah, remnant from a remnant. Now, what's the difference between the word synagogue and ecclesia? Why did Stephen talk about the ecclesia? Why did the early Christians talk about the ecclesia? Why didn't they use the word synagogue? Jesus went to the synagogue. Why not use the word synagogue? Well, the word ecclesia means a calling out, a group called out, a true group called out from a group that has become a little bit of a mixed multitude, a little bit defective. But by contrast, the word synagogue means a bringing together or a collection of persons. Tremendous difference. The church is a called out group, a true group, a real group, a faithful group. The synagogue means a collection of persons, a kind of a mixed multitude. And the origin of the name synagogue is probably to be assigned to the Babylonian exile. Say, just think 500 BC. That's the simplest way of thinking of it. And so in the time of the Babylonian exile, 600 to 500 BC, when the Jews had no temple, the Jews assembled together in captivity to read the law. And the practice continued in various buildings after the return from the exile. Now I'm going to stop at this point and make a little side trip and say this: where do we get our pulpit from in the church? Where the idea of a pulpit come from? Kind of a central podium. Well, when the Jews were in exile, particularly in the time of Ezekiel, the Holy Scriptures were kept in a convenient box with a central location, and so they'd get the Scriptures out of the box. And basically, this is where the idea of the pulpit and somebody standing at a central position in the front of a group talking to them, that's where the idea comes from. Well, Stephen points then, at this point in his speech, to Jesus as the prophet that Moses foretold. Okay, now Stephen is pointing now to Jesus. Now we're getting serious. Now we're getting to some real issues. Stephen points to Jesus as the prophet that Moses spoke about and identifies Jesus with the presence in the Ark of the Covenant, or in other words, he is saying that Jesus is the Shekinah, that Jesus is the God of glory, that Jesus is the one who spoke on Sinai. And what Stephen is getting at by the use of this term ecclesia or remnant or called out seems to be, to me, to be that the children of Israel consisted of two groups. Those who were physically present at gatherings and those who were spiritually present at gatherings. And you always have these two groups in any church, in any synagogue for that matter, in any temple for that matter. Stephen then points out that their fathers had rejected this angel, this angelic presence, and turned to paganism and to worshiping the host of heaven, including the pagan gods Moloch and Remphan. And the interesting thing is that Stephen does not say, your fathers worship the host of heaven, your fathers worship pagan gods, your fathers worship Moloch and Remphan. That would have been serious enough, or a chunk of your fathers did. But Stephen says, you did it. He says to the Jews listening to him, you did that. And Stephen then points out that God had several dwelling places during their checkered history, but that God doesn't need to and doesn't dwell in temples made with hands. Finally, Stephen accuses them of betraying their sacred commission as a nation and of betraying and murdering the Holy One and the Just. Now, the terms Holy One and the Just are Old Testament terms. The Holy One of Israel is the God of Israel. And so he is saying, you murdered the Holy One, you murdered the Just, you murdered the prophesied prophet, you murdered the presence in the ark.
Every 6 seconds, in developing nations all over the globe, a child dies for the lack of a few cents worth of food or medicine. As you've been listening to me, 3 children have already died. Children who have so much potential dying a horrible death due to hunger. The change in your purse or your pocket could probably feed that child for a day or more, and yet that clock keeps ticking and children keep dying. For almost 6 decades, world missionary evangelism has been pulling children from the brink of death back to life. And we've been doing it through programs like Food for Hunger. Today, you can be a part of that. Today, you can save a life. Today, you can build a bridge from hopelessness to hope and fully show the compassion that you have in your heart. Why don't you make an impact and save one right now? The clock is ticking on another life. Won't you stop the death of one child?
Well, we continue talking about the martyrdom of Stephen. And in the previous segments, we mentioned that the 3 things that the Jews reverenced and respected were Moses, the law given on Sinai, and the temple at Jerusalem. And Stephen had been accused of speaking against the law and against Moses and against the temple at Jerusalem. And so Stephen is dealing with these things from a factual and historical point of view. So as far as the professed allegiance of the Jewish people to Moses was concerned, the history of Moses, whom the Jews trusted, was fatal to the pretense of allegiance. Just look at the history. They say, oh, we were loyal and to Moses. Look at your history. You weren't loyal to Moses at all. And even when Moses was on Sinai, they had been disloyal to him and spoke of him as, quote, this Moses, and as one who had gone they knew not where. And false to Moses, the Jewish people had been yet more false to God. The Levitical sacrifices had been abandoned from the very time of their institution for sacrifices to the host of heaven and the tabernacle of Moloch. You know, there's some very interesting things in the Old Testament, if people would take the trouble to read them. But in the days of Jeremiah, Jeremiah rebuked the women of Israel for worshiping these gods and cooking cakes for the queen of heaven. And basically, they told Jeremiah to get lost. That was their response. So the history of the Jewish people was against them. So they replaced Levitical sacrifices with sacrifices to the host of heaven, the tabernacle of Moloch, and the star of Remphan, which had been dearer to them, in fact, than the tabernacle of witness and the Shekinah of God. Well, Stephen pointed out that at last, after wandering the wilderness, a Jesus or a Joshua led them. Actually, the name Joshua and the name Jesus are both the same. And by the way, it is interesting that when the Lord sent them a deliverer in Jesus, he came in the pattern of Joshua, not Moses. But at any rate, going back to the wilderness and coming out of the wilderness, Jesus or Joshua led them in their tabernacle into the land of which he possessed the Gentiles. But even that tabernacle, after an obscure and dishonored history, had passed away. And it may perhaps be intimated that the passing away of the tabernacle was due to their indifference and neglect. David, their very own David, had indeed desired to replace it by another. But the actual building of the house of God was carried out by the less faithful Solomon. But even at the very time that the house was built, the temple of Solomon, it had been implied in the prayer of David and in the dedication prayer of Solomon that the Most High does not dwell in temples made with hands. And to guard against the dangerous superstition into which the reverence paid to material places is apt to degenerate, the great prophet cried out in God's name, quote, "Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. And what house will you build for me, saith the Lord, or what is the place of my abiding? Did not my hands make all these things?" And the inference from this, these words uttered at the building of the temple by David and Solomon, the inference is that the day had to come of which Jesus prophesied to the woman of Samaria, in which neither Mount Gerizim nor yet Mount Jerusalem would be the place where men would worship God. And this constitutes a perfect defense against the charge that anything which he had said could be regarded as a blasphemy against the temple. Well, thus far, up to this point, Stephen had fulfilled all the objectives of his speech and had shown that injurious words had been as far as possible from his thoughts. By the time Stephen got through, they knew that any accusation that he'd spoken against Moses, against the law, against the temple, any disrespect was not there, but he was showing a higher fulfillment. Well, it had become clear also from his summary of the national story that the principles which he had advocated were in accordance with the teaching of those past ages, that the rejection of Christ by the rulers of his nation was no argument against his claims. He had shown that the temple could not have been meant to be the object of an endless honor. And lastly, that if Stephen had said that Jesus would change the customs which Moses had delivered, Moses himself had indicated that in God's due time, his entire dispensation was designed to pass away. And he had stated the grounds from which these conclusions followed, rather than urging upon them the inferences themselves. And Stephen had done this in deference to their prejudices and passions, and in the hope of bringing the truth gently into their hearts. We know Stephen, and I've thought about this myself in reading the account of Stephen. Stephen might have continued the story of Israel through the centuries of apostate kings, stained with the blood of prophets, down to the great retribution of the exile. And he might have shown how, after the exile, the obsolete idolatry of gods of wood and stone had only been superseded by the subtler and more self-complacent idolatry of formalism and letter worshipping. And we as Christians should bear that in mind.
For so much of the world, in places that world missionary evangelism has missions, water is not there. And when it is, it's not safe. World missionary evangelism for more than 50 years has drilled and dug water wells. And we've done it more than just to supply a community with water. We've done it to save lives. Because the largest killer in most third world countries is fouled or polluted water. Our water programs have saved thousands of lives. Not long ago, we drilled a well in Kenya, and a man who watched the water coming out of the ground, an elder in a Maasai community, walked up to our president and said, "Did your God do this?" And essentially, yes, he did. It has changed an entire community. That water well began it, but now there's education through schools. There's children's programs. There are churches. There are so many other things going on thanks to a gift of water. The next time you drink a glass of water from your tap, remember, it's pure gold in many parts of the world. The next time you pour a glass of water out, think that you're pouring out something that someone else would treasure more than anything else.
Well, we continue with the speech, the apology, the sermon, the message that Stephen gave in his own defense after he had been accused of blaspheming against Moses, against the law, and against the temple, and using historical evidence, which the Jews knew only too well. Stephen pointed out to them the inconsistency of their position, that they claimed to honor things that historically they had not honored. And coming to the book of the law, he pointed out that the book had been honored to the oblivion of the truths which it enshrined. Now, this is interesting because there's some great country and western songs, some of which go back to a very superstitious time in the South in the United States of America. But I remember an old song that went like this: dust on the Bible, dust on God's holy word, the sayings of the prophets, or the writings of the prophets, and the sayings of our Lord. And if you were to look at Bibles in many houses, there was dust on them, but you notice the gold plate was still intact. They weren't being used. And it was the same with the Jews. People, my father used to say, if people can't do something, then they write a song and sing about it. And so this is what is happening. Stephen is pointing out that the book, the physical book of the law, the scrolls of the law, had been honored to the oblivion of the truths which it enshrined. And how in their tithing of the mint and the anise and the cumin, small stuff, there had been a forgetfulness of the weightier matters of the law and mercy and judgment. And how the smoke of dead sacrifices had been thought to be of more avail than deeds of loving mercy. He went on to show how even circumcision and Sabbatism had been elevated above faith and purity, and how the long series of crimes against God's messengers had been consummated by the murder of the Lord of glory. Which of the prophets, said Jesus, have you not murdered and slaughtered, which spoke beforehand of the coming of the Holy One and just? Well, a truth which is only suggested often comes home to the heart with far more force than one which is put in straightforward, direct words. And it may have been Stephen's original intent and design to guide his listeners into conclusions rather than refute accusations. But if so, the faces of Stephen's audience showed that his object had failed. They were listening with stolid self-complacency to a narrative of which the significant incidents only enabled them to glory in their fathers. You know, there's an old statement that nothing is more dangerous than faded glory. Nothing is more dangerous than faded glory. You're seeing that today with Iran, formerly known as Persia. And it was evidently something in the aspect, the appearance of his audience, some sudden conviction that to such invincible obstinacy his words were addressed in vain. And so Stephen suddenly stopped short in his review of history and hurls in their face the gathered thunder of his wrath and scorn. So he goes from being conciliatory and diplomatic to being absolutely up and up, straightforward. And he said, stiff-necked and uncircumcised in your heart and ears. That had to hurt. Uncircumcised in your heart and ears. You are ever in conflict with the Holy Spirit. As your fathers, so are you. And which of the prophets, Stephen said, did not your fathers persecute? That was the truth. And they killed those who had announced before, respecting the coming of the just one, of whom you now prove yourselves betrayers and murderers. You, who received the law at the ordinance of angels and didn't keep it. Well, if that didn't get it, nothing would. And a denunciation so scathing and so fearless from a prisoner whose life depended on their will, I think it startled him. And this strong burst of righteous indignation against those whom he addressed as, quote, brethren and fathers, can only be accounted for by the long pent-up feelings of one whose patience has been exhausted. Have you ever seen somebody reach the end of their patience? I had a brother like that, and he would take abuse, but the day would finally come when I would hear him make a statement. It always made my blood run cold, because he said, now let me tell you something. And what he said was absolutely deadly and slaughtering. When people have had it, when their patience has been exhausted, out it comes. But Stephen could hardly have addressed them in words more calculated to kindle their fury. And the very terms in which he characterized their bearing, borrowed from their own law and prophets, added force to the previous summary of their history. And to call them uncircumcised in heart and ears was to reject with scorn the idle fancies that circumcision in the flesh alone was sufficient to save them from God's wrath. And the idea that uncircumcision on the part of a believer was worse than a crime. And with these words, Stephen summarized his defense.
When many think of world missionary evangelism, they think of us as an organization that provides meals for the hungry. We do that, but in many cases, this is just the beginning. We also provide farm animals for families. Why? Because this allows us to give them something that can help them win the battle of hunger each and every day. A farm animal, such as a chicken, a hog, milk goats, a milk cow, or a water buffalo, can feed a family by providing eggs, milk, cheese, and other products. They can also serve as a source of income for selling food and offspring at local markets.